Welcome to episode 17 of When Safeguarding Fails, the Lizzie Gladwell Crisis. I'm Jeremy Gladwell, Lizzie's dad, and I'm telling the heartbreaking true story of how our daughter, a vulnerable young person, was taken, isolated, and subjected to coercive control, and how she was cast adrift by the agencies tasked with safeguarding. February 2024, 7 months after Lizzie's removal. On Tuesday, February the 6th, at lunchtime, just as I was about to make cheese on toast, my mobile phone rang. The display read, "Private number." I answered, and the caller introduced himself as Detective Constable Roscoff. His tone was polite and upbeat, but I was initially wary, jaded by my experiences with the failures of Humberside Police so far. DC Roscoff mentioned that he worked in the Policing Vulnerable Persons team at Humberside Police and had been assigned to this case. He asked if I could give him the lowdown on the situation. Although he had seen there was a substantial amount of paperwork to read, he wanted to hear directly from me to better understand things. I began by thanking him for his unusually proactive tone, a sharp contrast to the apathy we had faced so far. To my surprise, DC Roscoff apologised for my previous experiences. He was even familiar with FASD and was working on another case involving an individual with FASD. We were starting off on the right foot, and there was finally some hope. We spoke for 40 minutes. I shared our painful journey, emphasising the key accusation that Lizzie, a vulnerable young person, had been groomed and enticed away from her family, life and familiar routines. She was isolated and controlled for what we could only presume to be financial exploitation. "This is about truth," I said. "We say they are lying. They will say we are lying. So far, without any regard for evidence or lack of, both Adult Social Care and the police have heard and believed the Wilson Clark account of things and dismissed what we are saying." DC Roscoff promised to investigate and get back to me, either later that week or the following week. He thanked me for my time. I thanked him for his call, and we hung up. Where had that surprising development come from? Suddenly, a detective constable was assigned to the case. We had shared enough information with a single point of access, our own MP, the MP for Grimsby, and people at church involved with a local authority. Who knows? Whatever the reason, we were grateful, as it offered us a fresh burst of hope. If DC Roscoff approached the case with integrity and curiosity, surely he would conclude it seemed far too suspicious to be innocent. The actions of Coral and Lewis were neither mistaken, naive, nor foolish. They were intentional, calculated, and cold, having nothing to do with Lizzie's best interests. I told family and friends of this new twist. "There's a detective constable on the case," I said, imagining an investigative sleuth armed with a magnifying glass and piecing together clues before gathering everyone together in the drawing room for the denouement. The Bible verse of the day seemed fitting. "The Lord is not slow in keeping his promise, as some understand slowness." Perhaps the DC Roscoff intervention was as a result of divine input, the angel come to set Lizzie free. By February 2024, Lizzie was almost entirely isolated from her family and friends. Seeing her was nearly impossible. We couldn't contact or visit her. She had been cut off. Almost. Her auntie and uncle in Hull were still in touch with her. They hadn't been blocked, and occasionally even took Lizzie out for lunch. Lewis needed to be there as well, of course. Those conversations and meetings with Lizzie occurred without our knowledge. We weren't informed, so we had no chance to show up. Either they were instructed not to tell us as a condition for seeing Lizzie, or they believed it was best to keep the link open without our awareness. Either way, Jane and I were deeply hurt by the secrecy. However, beyond the hurt, both Jane and I felt some relief whenever we heard someone had seen Lizzie. Such snippets reassured us that she was, okay? To what extent was she okay? Truly okay? Even if Lizzie was unaware of the manipulation she faced, even if she seemed happy, did that mean she was truly okay? Nonetheless, though bewildered and hurt by family members seeing Lizzie without informing us, we took comfort from any scraps of news. We were conflicted, of course. Even the grandparents were not told anything about the visits. At family gatherings, nobody spoke about Lizzie. Conversations were light and generic, covering anything and everything but Lizzie. It was incredibly difficult. I hated the thought of Lizzie being gradually erased from the collective memory. Lizzie was a daughter, a cousin, a niece, a granddaughter. She should have been there, laughing, sharing meals with her family and playing with her cousins. She had disappeared. Because of the intense emotions involved and the risk of an outpouring of frustration, Lizzie became a taboo topic. It was awful, truly awful, with family relationships strained to breaking point. Unknown to us, a meeting was arranged between Lizzie and her auntie and uncle. Lizzie was picked up and went to Hull. Not only did she go to Hull, but she even stayed overnight, having a sleepover in the living room with her cousin Amy, aged 20. This was Lizzie, just Lizzie, without Lewis or Coral, visiting her auntie, uncle and cousins and staying overnight, her first with a family member since turning 18. Most significant. The next day, there were affectionate hugs and goodbyes. Lizzie was driven back to Grimsby. The visit had gone well, or so it seemed. On the evening before the sleepover, Lizzie phoned Lewis before going to bed. She expressed a wish to return to Grimsby, but Lewis persuaded her to stay overnight, as he wouldn't be home anyway. So she stayed. Lizzie was never alone with anyone for more than a minute or two. Even during the collecting and returning, 2 people accompanied her in the car. The only exception was overnight, when Lizzie and Amy were in the living room. Lizzie's phone kept buzzing with message notifications, which she continually replied to. This continued, message after message. Even after the main light was turned off and it was time to sleep, the messages kept arriving into the early hours of the morning, illuminating the phone screen. Eventually, Amy asked Lizzie to switch the phone off because it was very late. So Lizzie turned it off, which was against the rules, of course, as it disconnected her from the Wilson-Clark grip. The next day, Amy and her boyfriend took Lizzie back to Grimsby. The visit had gone well, that was that, until a week later, when the uncle received a message asking him to contact a named officer at Humberside Police as soon as possible. He was in Scotland on a business trip at the time, but found an opportunity to ring. He was informed that Lizzie had made a serious allegation against him, but no more details could be given over the phone. He said he would be back in Hull the next day, and the officer said that she would be in touch. At 4 a.m. the following morning, 4 officers from Humberside Police descended on his home, hammered on the door, seized his IT devices, and arrested him. He was taken to the station and charged with rape. He was locked in a dirty cell for 6 hours before being forced to give fingerprints and a DNA sample. When we learned of this calamitous event, there was no doubt in our minds about his innocence, especially because the chronology didn't fit. There had simply been no opportunity for the alleged assault to take place. Many months later, after intense trauma for him and his family and a serious impact on his work, life and mental health, the police concluded the same. They declared that no further action would be taken because there was never a case to answer. The accusation was grotesque and baseless. What on earth was going on? Why such a swift and aggressive response? Why so early and dramatic? This was surely it. This had to be the point at which even Gary Atkinson began to consider whether he had believed lies, thereby supporting the manipulation and exploitation of a vulnerable individual. The arrest of Lizzie's uncle, charged with rape, severed ties between Lizzie and her family. Of course it did. How could it not? Even after the arrest, Lizzie sent text messages to her cousin Amy. Amy didn't reply. Amy couldn't reply. There were criminal proceedings against her own dad, and the legal advice was to make no response. Lizzie, oblivious to the chaos she had been used to unleash, continued messaging Amy, asking why her cousin wasn't replying. Lizzie had no idea of the emotional wreckage Coral's manipulation had caused. Capacity? I don't think so. Lizzie had no idea what was going on, and that's my point. Even with everything happening, with lives and livelihoods being trashed by evident malice, if anyone had done a welfare visit and asked Lizzie how she was, she would have said she was okay. But she was not okay. This was not okay. Far from it. We were certain that Coral had surely now gone too far, that we would get a call from some senior officer in charge of the investigation who would have genuine interest and concern into the big picture narrative. Not at all. Were the accusations made because Lizzie had switched off her phone? Was it a punishment? A devastating and final means of severing any link Lizzie had to her family? Was it in fact an elaborate setup with Lizzie as the unwitting tool? Yes, probably, all of the above. Had Lizzie been coerced into something she didn't want to go through with? Is that why she wanted to leave on the first evening? What power of persuasion was used to compel Lizzie to accompany Coral to the police station to make the false accusation? Who knows? But I am certain of one thing. This was not Lizzie's doing. Anyone who knew Lizzie would understand this. Unfortunately, once again, Humberside Police failed to consult anyone familiar with Lizzie. No professional curiosity was shown. Despite the Home Office statutory guidance on controlling or coercive behaviour, which explicitly refers to acts of coercion or force to persuade the victim to do something they are unwilling to do, such as coercing them into criminal behaviour or making false allegations to statutory agencies. The guidance highlights the risk of intimidation or threats to report alleged offences to the police. It is there, in black and white, in the guidelines, precisely what was happening to Lizzie. The rape allegation prompted Humberside Police to make a dramatic arrest with excessive force and aggression. By responding in this way, the police became active accomplices in the controlling behaviour displayed by Coral, who from the outset sought to isolate Lizzie from her true family after removing her from her home. Now Coral had achieved that aim, fully utilising the services of Humberside Police in the process. Humberside Police had been complicit in the coercive control of Lizzie Gladwell. This felt like the big event we had been waiting for, the one that would finally jolt the statutory agencies out of their bureaucratic stupor. It was surely the catalyst that would force the police and adult social care to recognise the obvious truth staring them in the face. A vulnerable young person was being manipulated and exploited. Our daughter was in danger. But no such realisation came. The police remained blinded by Coral's deception. For months we had informed Humberside Police that our daughter, taken from her home one day after she turned 18, had been isolated from her family, subjected to evident coercive control, and systematically manipulated. We suggested there was likely some form of exploitation. Despite our repeated concerns, they ignored and dismissed us. Indeed, a serving officer at Humberside Police even warned me to stop raising incident logs. Then, the alleged perpetrator of this control escorted the vulnerable young person to the police station to make a false allegation of rape against her uncle. I don't claim to know police systems or protocols, nor do I know the policies or organisational structure of Humberside Police. What I say here is simply my own view, based on our experience and what I believe to be common sense. Wouldn't you expect that, before sending in the police response unit to cause irreparable trauma to an innocent man and his family, someone at Humberside Police would connect the dots and see what was happening? The dots were numbered. There weren't that many of them. The picture, frankly, was quite obvious. We've all done dot-to-dots like that as children, where you can see it's an elephant just from the dots. Before making an unnecessary arrest, someone at Humberside Police might have contacted Jane and me as Lizzie's parents to ask how these threads connected. You might have thought that, after all we had said, Humberside Police would exercise reasonable doubt before rushing to act on Coral's orchestrated plot to destroy Lizzie's family relationships. Of course, nobody from Humberside Police contacted us. Instead, they followed Coral's wishes, who had aimed from the start to sabotage Lizzie's connections to her family and support network. I say this carefully, but I mean it. This appears indistinguishable from complicity with criminal coercive control. How was Lizzie? How was she feeling after making such a devastating accusation against her uncle? An accusation that could irreparably damage her relationship with her cousins, aunties, uncles, and grandparents. What mental trauma was Lizzie experiencing? Was she fearful? Tearful? Did she understand what she had done? Who was supporting her? The Wilson Clark family? Was it believable that Coral would support Lizzie? This entire destructive campaign was imagined, executed, and perpetrated by Coral. Who was there for Lizzie at this critical point? Gary Atkinson? Really? Groomed, enticed, captured and controlled, Lizzie was now being exploited as weaponry against her own family. But we knew our Lizzie was still in there somewhere, scared, sorry, and desperate for things just to go back to how they were. That conviction kept us going. We couldn't reach her. We couldn't talk to her. We couldn't text her. We couldn't visit her. We couldn't help her. We couldn't support her. We couldn't give her a hug. We couldn't fix this. Tears, grief, and frustration consumed us. Lizzie wasn't just our daughter. She was a niece, a cousin, a granddaughter. Yet she had been reduced to a pawn in someone else's selfish game. Coral and Lewis had succeeded in isolating her from those who truly loved her, using her for their own ends without any regard for the harm they inflicted on her or anyone else. Coral still had another part of her plan that required the involvement of Humberside Police to enforce Lizzie's isolation. And once again, Humberside Police seemed willing to comply. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of When Safeguarding Fails, the Lizzie Gladwell Crisis. If you found it moving or helpful, or if you think our story could help others, then please like, share, or simply tell others about it. Thank you again, and join me for the next episode.